Kia ora everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've had a number of business confidence indicators coming out in recent times, all showing a much more upbeat and optimistic mood from the business community, thinking about the pathway ahead. Both the likes of the ANZ Business Outlook survey, but also NZIER's quarterly survey of business opinion. Like I say, better figures coming through, a lot more confidence. Not quite showing rocket ship to the moon levels of economic activity, but a surefire turnaround and seems to speak to that idea of greener shoots coming through in 2025. You've had a bit of a look through all of the various figures. What could you tell from them?
Yeah, so firstly, looking forward, businesses, like you say, more confident about the future, both in terms of the general economy and also in terms of their own activity. Expectations for own activity from ANZ were at their highest in 8 years, business confidence its highest in 10 years. Those are very strong numbers, obviously. When you look at the NZIER's QSBO, what they're talking about there, confidence again is up, but in terms of actual trading activity, recent experience, that is still very weak. So telling us the economy is weak right here and now, but people are increasingly optimistic, increasingly hopeful that things will be better going forward in coming quarters. Other sort of consistent themes coming through: labour market weakness, still a lot of softness across all those indicators around the labour market, employment intentions, the ease of finding labour, all those sort of things as well. And generally speaking, continuing to see a softening trend around the sort of cost and price pressures, which we've seen for several quarters. There was a little bit of a tick up in some of the cost indicators around expectations for the next few months. And I feel that's probably tied in with some of the electricity shortages and the high prices we've seen there, and some fear that that may flow through into higher costs for businesses. But generally speaking, those pricing indicators were still quite weak. And indeed, when you look at retail or merchants' pricing expectations going forward from here, they are at their weakest, apart from lockdown, in several, well, probably 10 years, maybe 20 to 30 years, depending on exactly which indicator you look at there, to the point where it does sort of raise questions now about not whether inflation will get back into the target band. I think that's pretty clear it will be. But it's a case of now, does it go below the midpoint of 2% and indeed start to threaten the bottom end of the target band, because potentially the Reserve Bank has squeezed the economy too hard and has kept interest rates too high for too long. So, yeah, despite the sort of optimism coming through around confidence and what that means for future activity levels, that is sort of, I think, playing on markets' minds in terms of, how does the Reserve Bank react to the numbers that it's seen here?
Well, and that's the interesting thing, right? You look at the Reserve Bank and what they said last time. They were worried about sort of near-term economic indicators continuing to worsen. Most of the economic indicator data since then has been fairly consistent with their view of it being bad, but it hasn't gotten even worse than their starting point. In fact, a lot of the data is probably ever so slightly better than they might have anticipated. They were picking a 0.5% fall in GDP. It actually came in at just 0.2%. Down still, it's still down, but it's not as bad as was expected. Again, a number of those other indicators also not showing quite as much economic chaos, perhaps, as was expected before. But even you had the ANZ Business Outlook survey come out with, like you say, high business confidence and some of those other indicators. And I think, one of the banks sort of said, well, if you were looking for evidence for the Reserve Bank to cut by 50 basis points, this didn't help the argument. Completely true. QSBO came out, though, and everyone has jumped on and said, well, it's absolutely certain that it's going to be a 50 basis point cut come the October meeting, which is sort of entirely different from where most people were, give it sort of 2 weeks ago or so. Really, it seems like the reality for the bank is there's not really an option to not cut in the October meeting, and nor in the November meeting. They've made that fairly clear that the direction is down and that it's happening. To be fair, they said the direction was up at one stage and then decided to cut. So I think we've got to take all of this with a grain of salt. I'm always a little bit worried, though, right, that all it takes is one indicator to come out and all of a sudden, we're all absolutely certain of the new direction for the Reserve Bank. I'm not quite so wedded to that view, particularly because the October monetary policy review comes out a week before the next set of inflation, which isn't really helpful from, are we doing enough on the inflation front yet? Yep, most indicators, our own, the banks, everyone else's, are in that much softer position around that, 2.2, 2.3% annual mark, sure. but you want to get a bit of a read for the numbers down below. I mean, looking at that, like I say, I'm pretty sure every single bank, retail bank that's come out with their monetary policy pick has now picked effectively 50 basis points for the next one. How sure do you think they are of that pick, and how sure should we be, and what's our own view, Gareth?
Yeah, can you be sure of anything with the Reserve Bank at the moment? I don't really think so. I mean, look, to me, it's getting increasingly close to a toss-up between 25 and 50. But I mean, we're still going with 25 at this stage on the basis, like you say, CPI is yet to come out and sort of confirm just how much inflation has slowed. The Reserve Bank will not be doing a full set of forecasts. That may not mean anything, of course, because they don't seem to put a lot of store on their own forecast anyway. So they may decide to cut by 50, even if they don't have the full information of what the sort of future forward-looking picture is as well. I mean, my preference would be to wait potentially until November when you've got a broader picture of the labour market from HLFS, inflation from the CPI. But the Reserve Bank, they have been captured by those sort of partial indicators recently, and we know one, those can be quite variable or volatile, but two, that means there's a hell of a lot of other stuff you can react to if you're not really paying attention to those sort of top tier pieces of data either. So, yeah, I'm incredibly unsure. I wouldn't be surprised with a 50 next week. It's interesting to see many of the banks now starting to talk about 250s before the end of this year, which would take the OCR down to 425. I mean, if the sort of sentiment around inflation proves to be correct and having squeezed the economy arguably too hard for too long, then that sort of action may be appropriate. But I guess what we're left with is, or struggling with, is that the Reserve Bank, it's still, again, pushing in that direction of such a huge shift from what they've previously signalled, what they've previously told us. I know we talked about after the last monetary policy statement and the surprise that was in that maybe we just ignore the bank's forecasts and look at the sort of messaging that comes from them in each statement and the sort of tone of those statements. We haven't, of course, had any statements since the August monetary policy review. So flying a bit blind, but yeah, 25. But gee, if it's a 50, I'm not going to be particularly surprised.
No, you're totally right. And I think the interesting thing, right, is that the bank has been somewhat at pains when it's tried to sort of, get itself out of the corner that it boxed itself into to say that, look, things will effectively be data dependent. The difficulty is we're not quite sure which data, because like you say, we haven't got any more inflation data actuals. We've got some partials coming in. But they don't often sort of tell us quite enough about those sort of core pressures around inflation. And realistically, like I say, if you want to look at the data, well, you look at the bank's pick on the likes of GDP and potential output and similar, and you go, well, it's actually better than they might have first expected. Whereas if you look at sort of those future looking indicators, the likes of the QSBO and even ANZ's business outlook survey to a degree, you go, well, maybe there is a case. Which one are they going to decide they put more weight on? They might not be sure until the day themselves either, which is just that difficulty of there is a lot of data and there's that piece around, are we looking at current activity and what that might do to current inflationary pressures, or are we looking at future activity and what that means for future inflationary pressures? And the bank has sort of picked and choose what it felt was best at the time, which, like I say, is why we find it difficult to read through. I guess part of the reason we're still almost leaning towards 25 is because that's what sort of has been more mapped out by the bank in previous times in terms of taking reasonable considered steps. They're not going to make big moves unless there was a particularly big shift in things. Like you say, one of the reasons that they perhaps could see there to be a big shift in current and future expected economic conditions is that sort of weakness in retail pricing pressures where, the worry or the fear that inflation drops out the bottom end of the target band of 1 to 3%. That's maybe a bit of a shift, but if that happens, it really does highlight that they've far overcooked things with the ratcheting up in interest rates. What's interesting, right, and I do personally still have some sympathy for this idea, is that surely if you think you know broadly where you need to get to with interest rates or anything else, you get there sort of as soon as possible. Now, I'm not saying that they go, we'll do 150 basis points all in one hit, but I guess if, like we say, it's pretty clear to them, it's pretty clear to everyone else that there's some pretty big changes that need to happen to get us from where we currently are in a very tight situation to more of a neutral position, you do wonder why they wouldn't at some point go 50-50-50 cuts. 3 in a row to get us closer to that position, instead of sort of stringing us out over sort of 6 meetings or so, or around about 8 months worth of time. I mean, how do we sort of weigh those pieces up? I guess on one hand, that would be maybe the position that you'd find yourself in if you were unencumbered by all of those different options put before you. But is there still a case to be made for why reasonable and considered is important?
Well, I guess for me, there's always a degree of uncertainty around how the economy evolves over the next 9, 12, 18 months. And that's why you tend to move in smaller steps rather than the larger ones, because you talk about knowing where you need to get to with interest rates. Well, you think you know, but whether you actually know is another question. Having said that, look, I mean, the general sort of gist of things now would be that the Reserve Bank probably kept things too tight for too long. And so, if they are a little bit behind the 8 ball, a little bit behind the curve in terms of cutting those interest rates, then cutting faster could well be appropriate. But it would be, effectively a concession. I don't think they'd ever concede it themselves, but it would be a concession that they've kind of got things wrong previously. I mean, the rebate or the remit of the Reserve Bank's task is to part of it is to avoid unnecessary stability in a whole range of variables, including interest rates. And here we are actually ratcheting them up rapidly, too slow to start with, and then having to go harder and faster later. Could well be that you were too slow to start with again here, and now you're having to go faster as well. Again, it's another policy failure. We've seen inflation head to over 7%. This is not maybe quite as egregious in terms of the failure, but it still is, not really achieving the Reserve Bank's core job or core mandate. So, yeah, not a great position for them to be in, to be perfectly honest.
And I think as well, part of the reason that I'd be much more comfortable with the idea of a 50 basis point cut in November rather than, say, October, like you say, you'd have a lot more data. And by that point, I think there's also a reason that you've got 3 months break for the Reserve Bank over summer. They might want a bit of insurance over that period. But like you say, sort of moving quickly in October, I completely agree. I think that, both options are live. But it's not necessarily as consistent with their previous signalling in terms of some of the economic data that's come out. It's more consistent with other sets of data. But like I say, there's sort of so many things in the mix, and it's been a lot harder to tell just how much weight they put on any one particular indicator in recent times. So long story short, interest rates look set to continue to fall. The question at the moment is around the pace of that, both in the short term and potentially in the slightly longer term into 2025. We'll assess how all of those different indicators move, what the different confidence measures do, and how the Reserve Bank views all of this on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.